problem with writing bios is that people read them. Often at times when it's not about me. I'm the one on the stage, but the stuff that I want to talk to you about today is decidedly about all of us and about how we think about design for the web, how we use type, and how it affects people's experience, and how it develops going forward. That's a really big piece of this. So you heard the intro. I've met a bunch of you before. Some of you I just met this week, and it's awesome making some new friends. So I'm going to go on a little bit of a journey. This is my companion for my journeys every morning. That's my pal Tristan. And we think about stuff in the mornings. And a lot of the stuff that I spend a lot of time thinking about is how to bring better design and experience to the digital products that we make, and what the impact is over time, and how we translate that from a love of letters and a love of type that I learned studying graphic design to understanding how big an impact it has as part of the design process, to how do we translate that to digital products, digital apps, websites, all of that sort of thing. So in thinking that through, and thinking about this talk, and the tweet that I put out before I came up here was perhaps, it could be taken as a bit of an egotistical thing. I think this is, in fact, one of the most important talks I will have ever given by the time we get to the end here. Because of the significance of the new things that I've got to show you, and just where it can take us. So we're going to talk a little bit about typography and UX and history, and that's going to start. Before we can go forward, we need to kind of look back and understand how that works, and see how it works going forward. So typography, as part of design, graphic design in general, has to do two things in order to be successful. And this is for any piece of design, no matter what, no matter how old, no matter how new, no matter how far in the future. It has to communicate an idea and influence behavior. That's what separates design from art. Design is arguably art that has to work for a living. It's one way to look at it. I had a good fortune of being in Warsaw recently, where I saw that last slide, and the poster history in Poland is unbelievable, as is their neon lettering, as a whole neon museum devoted to it. But this is just another example of how we present type influences how people receive that message. That's what's really fundamental about that bridge between type and user experience. And in the past, it's been on a printed page or on a billboard. It's just evolving a little bit in the platform. But those things are fundamentally tied. It's that bridge between the viewer and the content itself. So here we've got an example in an electronic format, an ebook, of Frank Camaro's The Shape of Design. It's an absolutely wonderful book, a beautiful printed book, and he did an equally beautiful job creating it in ebook format and in HTML and on mobile. And in each case, it's that same words, but presented in a way that provides the best possible experience in that context, to be able to get the most out of that message, to amplify that experience. So that's something that is only going to get harder and more difficult, but also more prevalent. Amazon has been selling more ebooks than print ones for over 5 years. We're well past that tipping point. So there's far more reading that is happening on digital devices than on print ones, and yet we've not managed to translate the quality of that reading experience into those digital platforms. There's another example of where things could go, where typography has tremendous impact on safety, on usability, and clearly just mundane things like truncation of text, creating stronger visual hierarchy, usable in multiple languages. The constraints of the physical technology in automobiles, in less expensive electronics, fitness devices, that sort of thing, is really hamstring the ability to communicate clearly. Now, this is a bit of a fantasy. That's not real yet, as evidenced by some of the products out there that I'll show you later on. But it is quite an interesting future to think about. So it's the material, it's the method, and it's the typefaces that actually form this foundation of the user experience in this case. It's that relationship between those elements that is fundamentally changing. So let's go back. Go back a few thousand years. Whether this is your personal belief system or not, the metaphor here is pretty strong. You could be fairly certain that this is important and immutable by the fact that it is literally carved in stone. There is something about the presentation of that content in this story that imparts permanence. You can't go back and erase that. Looking at this choir book from about 14th, 15th century Italy, this something was painstakingly crafted by hand, beautifully illuminated. Only the people of the greatest wealth could actually own something like this. But the idea that is presented here is that this is something so important, so profound, that it had to be presented in this way in order to convey the importance of the words contained therein. Now, this hits closer to home for me. This comes forward a couple of centuries to a story that was read to me when I was about 5 or 6 years old by my father, and this is our personal copy. Beautiful cloth, hardbound copy. It's printed in the 60s, so chances are this is letterpress printed. It has that smell and that tactility. Everything about it reinforces the intimacy of this small tale. It really profoundly impacted me throughout my life, and everything about it is because of the way it's presented. There's an experience that's imparted through the way this was physically made. Here's another example of a typeface that became virtually a national identity. The Johnson Typeface has been in continuous use for 100 years as of this year. Has an incredibly complete way of being presented and used. Doesn't really matter if there are changes in the color system. You see those letter shapes, you know you've gone underground. It's very powerful. The shape of those letters imparting that feeling. When we see a black sign with white blocky Helvetica on it, we know we're in the New York System subway. When we see Parisine, we know we're in the Paris airport. We have these really strong ties. And I apologize, I don't have a Canadian example, but the ties that we have between letter forms and a place and a language are very, very strong. So that is part of the experience. It's a core part of that experience. Times, or Times New Roman. This is the origin for this newspaper. And that typeface was designed to actually do two things that are specific to user experience. One, impart authority. When you see that stable serifs and really strong, upright, and bold contrast, you know that that is the voice of an authoritative source of news. It also had very clever little ink traps cut in it so that it could be printed on really cheap newsprint and still be readable at small sizes. Interestingly enough, there's still a way to improve that experience. If you have a butler to iron the newspaper for you, then you can actually reduce ink transfer and create a shinier, stiffer piece of paper, much more akin to the way the Wall Street Journal appears today. Again, it's a feeling of quality that's all tied to the words there on the page and the shape therein to reinforce the authority of the voice that is coming to you through those words. So that's pretty significant to me. The more I started thinking about how was UX, how was that a thing before we called it UX? Well, I think it has been a thing for centuries, millennia even going back to cave paintings in France. There was an authority there because it was something on the wall that was permanent, that was telling them where to go find food. So this has been part of our communication and our ability to communicate beyond the substance of the words that are on the page or the shapes that are on the wall for a very, very long time. So how does that bridge to now? Well, through all of our centuries and millennia of progress, we came out to the web, and we have a few million pages that look a little bit like this. Millions and millions of pages of Arial. Thousands of devices that have one typeface here, another one in the app, another one on the web, yet a different one used in their printed communication. Where is the voice and authority of Garmin? I mean, most people who ride bicycles know Garmin as the way to not get lost, or the way to record your ride and upload it to Strava so everybody else knows that you rode too. I'm guilty. But the voice is lost. So that authority is diminished because I can't look at any one of those things and know with certainty that it's actually a Garmin thing and not some other one. And you can see throughout that, primarily, this is a text interface. That is the most prevalent thing in any app design. I tweeted about this earlier today, and I got 2 other people tweeting back, and I appreciate the discourse, but white space and layout, that's not what conveys tone and information. It's the content that does that. It's the words. So it's the way those words that provide it that really becomes central. So this is another test. Raise your hand when you can tell me what time it is. Yeah, you all hit the bus. Because in all the time it takes looking down to figure out where the time is showing up on that display, because of the constraints in the electronics preventing them from having more scalable type that could create a better hierarchy, we've all just rear-ended a bus. That's a serious problem. And that's a serious problem tied to type as part of that experience. Now, there's plenty of other complications in automotive design, so I don't really want to, put Subaru under the bus, but automotive manufacturers in general are in kind of a bad way. Google Android Auto and Apple's CarPlay are a really interesting development for that center console piece. But if you remember that first shot that I showed you from an automotive interface, that was in the dashboard. We don't have help there until the automotive manufacturers put priority on design to put better type and hierarchy right in front of us as we're driving. So that's only part of the problem solved by having a better center console. It'll help. It will help raise awareness, but it's still not there. Our present is far from perfect. So what's changed now that we can actually do this better or create these better experiences and move forward? I would contend everything, and that was before I had even more everything to show you as of last Friday. So just bear with me for a little bit. As we started designing things for the web, we had an ability to start to do more as we were added font tags, and we added CSS, and then we added web fonts. And if everybody loves web fonts, just at some point today, just go thank this guy down in the front row here. He's one of the people that helped make @FontFace happen. Sorry, I had to call that out and say thanks. I will have to admit, I didn't know that when I first met him. I found out reading his Wikipedia page. I felt a little dumb to not know that, but thank you, Chris. So, interesting things started to happen with responsive design. You'll notice they had an overlay with the text and photo, but on the small screen, they've made arguably a better choice to separate those elements to better present the content in a more readable way. But that doesn't really get at the whole problem, because everything I've been showing you up to this point were things that could be designed and known where those relationships stand. And this is something that's a fundamental difference about typography today in digital systems than anything that's come before. So prior to these last couple weeks, this was the most significant thing that I had to talk about in this talk, which is a change in how we practice typography. Going from something that we could know about, we put these letters down over this photo, and we know when it goes to press, it's going to have exactly this relationship, and these words are going to fit so beautifully around this highlighted area of the photo. It's going to be absolutely fantastic. We throw that same thing on the web, and then someone resizes the window or turns their phone sideways, and we have a completely different layout. Or they log in tomorrow, and they change the content altogether. So we've moved from rendered to dynamic. And that's pretty big. So what we have is now the requirement that we think differently about how we practice typography. So we look at this cover from Emigre number 70. It's a gorgeous book. Look how beautifully all of those lines of very differently styled and sized type line up. Absolutely perfect. Leah would probably argue that if you used viewport units, you could do that on the web, no problem. And you can, until somebody logs in tomorrow and changes it to volume 71, and it's not going to line up anymore unless you change the viewport units. So we have to think differently about how we design. That can't be a requirement. So when we think about film production, credit sequence from the movie Seven, how many people have seen that? I would contend that's about the best 2 minutes of storytelling in film. I mean, it was really pretty phenomenal stuff. But when you think about how that was designed, they knew exactly where those letters were going to fall. Look at that top left corner, how those letters fall beautifully in the shaded shape of the end of those pages. That can't happen in a responsive design. You're never going to be able to keep that proportion. Again, with the viewport units, maybe, but that's not the point. So this is our reality. As we work in content management systems and other kinds of dynamic sources of content, where this is, I'm sorry about Donald Trump. I'm sorry. International edition of the Guardian homepage and the domestic version. Different content, same layout system. Everything still has to work with different length headlines, different length words. I'm really sorry I didn't get slides from this fellow Titus that designed Arabic fonts for this site. He had some fantastic shots. Same design system. Same design system, works right to left and left to right with all of those characters. It all just works. Really smart design system, but cannot rely upon specific relationships between type and layout. It's systems of hierarchy that can scale. Very, very important distinction. There's another one with France 24 with the English language version and the French language version. Now that's a small differentiation of word length. When you go from English to German, it's about a 40% difference in length of strings of text. That's a massive problem. Or when they have to name something new and they string 47 words together without a hyphen, that's hard. So, we need ways to deal with things like that. And currently, we have very few. When we have all these constraints about what we can load and how we can determine the size of the device and how we react to that, CSS gives us some, but not many ways to deal with that. We can play with letter spacing a little bit, we can play with font size a little bit, but otherwise, we've got to live within the constraints of the system as it's presented. So, our way forward with this has been evolving, but there are a lot of things that we can do now that really change how we can practice typography. So, system fonts are web-safe fonts. They never really were, but that's okay. It's our fiction. We'll stick to it. Web-safe fonts gave you very little control. You had 10 to 15 that you could relatively certainly count on, but it's certainly not going to deal with things like condensed typefaces or anything like that. The advent of fonts.com, Typekit, WebType, all of these services that leverage at font face to embed beautiful type on the screen really does a lot to allow for greater voice and communication and flexibility in what we choose for a typeface based on the content and the brand that we're trying to represent. The advent of Opentype features allows the use of beautiful swashes and ligatures and all kinds of other wonderful elements in our typefaces with the advent of WAF, which is the wrapper around either Opentype or TrueType fonts that will allow us to use them on the web. Opentype features allow for things like type a 1/2, supply one line of CSS, and you get a fraction. That's fantastic, and not just for recipe sites. There's a lot of other things that you can do that are beyond just embellishments in Western languages, but actually ligatures that can't be reached with anything other than an Opentype feature for proper communication in, for example, traditional Arabic versus a more sort of Persian way of writing things. Thank you, Titus. So WAF is the format that lets us do this. It's got about 92% support for devices on the web. WAF 2 offers a very conservative 25% file reduction. Oftentimes, it's much more. It's gone up 8%. It's at about 64% device support. That's across all it is supported across all major shipping devices with the exception of Opera Mini. That's a separate story. And actually, I would take issue at people saying that they've got other problems if they have to support Opera Mini. It's just different challenges in customer base. There's nothing wrong with that. Sorry, that was a tangent from a talk yesterday. So, WAF 2, very important development, much greater performance that we get out of this with smaller file sizes, with all of these features supported. That's fantastic. When we couple that with a smart design system that will address different type sizes that are used across various screen sizes, that brings us to a much better world of typography that we can bring to bear in our designs for much more effective and compelling communication that will survive with all of these changes in screen sizes and content. That is what I mean by a new typography. So this is designing systems that can handle changes in screen size that we can't predict, device orientation, the content itself, the language. All of those things can be handled because we've designed a typographic and a design system that can allow for that reflow and react appropriately based on the absence or presence of those files, the font files themselves. So, beautifully designed site that's been thought about very carefully, but you could imagine that that headline is probably not going to fit well on a phone unless they're smart and they resize it. So we've got media queries. That's what responsive typography is all about, is thinking about how should the typography respond. Not the type, not the layout. Talking about the typography, the typographic system, the way you size things and set them across varying screen sizes. That's what's going on here, sizing it appropriately for a range of screen sizes. Donnie Truong's beautiful site about the history of Vietnamese writing is absolutely gorgeous, and he used Opentype features, so you can see the ligature connecting the S and the T in the title. It's really beautifully done. He's an incredibly talented guy, both from a design, he's a great writer, and he also codes like a pro. Well, he is a pro. And if you look it up, he wrote Pro Web Type. You should check that out. That's a freely available book on web typography online. He had also set this up to work well on small screen. Note the absence of the ligature up top. That was in WebKit from a few months back when I first screenshot it, but the code was all there. So, beautiful example of progressive enhancement. They finally rolled out font feature setting support, and it just started working. He didn't have to do anything. So that's what's really wonderful about these kinds of systems and coding it well and appropriately, is that it may not be supported everywhere. And we as designers have to give up that vanity and accept it, that is still going to be the most appropriate that we can deliver on various devices. And as those devices improve in their capability, things just start working better. So that's pretty fantastic. I did another experiment earlier, I guess it was last year now, where I took this print publication and decided I wanted to figure out how could we translate that feel from this beautifully laid out piece on ghost signs. You can see the spreads in here, really nicely done. They've got a wonderful sort of asymmetry to them that really draws you in, but that might be a challenge to do on the web. I mean, there's a lot of things set on their side, a lot of different typefaces, but it actually wasn't that bad. So this is it represented as a web page, using some web fonts, using CSS, and you can see as you scroll down the page, it's not exact, but it's a pretty good representation of the intent of that design. And I think when you look at those things side by side, you know they're related, but this is presenting it in a way that is more appropriate to consume that content on a device where we're used to scrolling. That's our natural action. It's not a side-to-side. We want to make sure that it works across all the devices, so we use that same principles of responsive typography to make sure that we size things appropriately for the viewport size, and we take away some of those things like the captions that are rotated on their side because we're more constrained. We just bring it right back underneath, and that's all just basic CSS. It's really important that we think through all of these things, because those demos are all well and good, but we know from being good practitioners of development for the web that we can't just throw 18 different fonts on a page and get away with it, because no one would be able to load it. So anyone that's actually responsible for the performance of that site is going to kick you out if you try and pull something like that. We have these constraints about not being able to load everything. And it's a bummer. It's more than a bummer. It's actually a pretty critical issue to me that we need to solve for performance and vocabulary and design, and the ability to actually do more with that one element, with the type on the screen, to get past this slump that we're in the design world right now. We've got a bunch of squishy boxes that can scale, but everything kind of looks the same. If it's not the Squarespace homepage of big photo and text overlay, it's material design cards endlessly scrolling past. We really need to think through where we're headed here, because as we can see with this graph of smartphone penetration in North America, right now we're at around 80-81%, and it's only going higher. We know from another presentation yesterday that more than 50% of web consumption in the US is now on a mobile device. All of these things have these devices may have wonderful capabilities, but they're on a severely constrained network. So again, our desire for greater typographic expression to create a more interesting and compelling design is constrained by the fact that we have these flaky network connections that may or may not be working well. I thought this was a great illustration of it. Just bringing this home, all of these challenges and issues have only been around for, in the US, 2 presidential campaigns. If you go back 3 presidential campaigns, there wasn't an iPhone either. I mean, there's a lot of change in the last few years. But it comes back to what's going to win. And Zach Leatherman is a little opinionated about this, but I really got a kick out of it. He's a one-issue voter. I can respect that. Thankfully, in his analysis of the presidential campaign sites, Hillary Clinton did much better. And I want to point out that 8 seconds, 5 seconds of that delay was the optimizedly JavaScript blocking page render. They could have fixed that. They could have fixed it. So take that away. Clear runaway winner with custom web fonts is still way faster than Donald Trump with no web fonts. Just a really crappy design. I won't comment any further on that. So with that limitation that we have for performance reasons, appropriate performance reasons, our vocal range is really curtailed. Type is the voice of our words. And when we can only use a couple of notes, we can't really create that strong hierarchy in the design. We really have a much more subtle range to work with. What if it wasn't? 3 weeks ago, less than 3 weeks ago, at the A-Type-I conference in Warsaw, Poland, which is the association, I'm going to butcher this, the International Typography Association. I'll just leave it at that, because I can't speak French very well. There was an announcement from quite a cast of characters. There were people from Google, from Apple, from Microsoft, from Adobe, all up talking about the new Opentype format. Opentype 1.8. And this is my one more thing. I'm probably going to totally blow the deadline, but this is big. So, in this session, they announced Opentype 1.8, which has very little, if any, relevance to anybody sitting in this room. However, when it is then talked about as variable fonts, now we're on to something. We're talking about a single font file that can store all of the variation in weight, width, slant, italics, X height, and even more. So all of that data can be stored in a single font file, plus you can define a custom axis upon which you might scale. So the format itself is extensible, so that as we design more features in the future, you'll be able to do even more. So rather than loading 18 font files to get a nice expressively designed page, you could load 1. I'm mentioning 18 for a reason, by the way. So here's another example. All of the different variations that could be contained in a single font file. And it does get more interesting. So this is a demo, and this is in FontLab. Thomas Finney at FontLab was incredibly generous to supply the software and allow us to see what might happen. See if this will play. There we go. Single font file. Think of all the different things we could do with that. All the emphasis that you could get. You might still want to load another font for display headings, but look at all the things that you could do with just one. It really made me think about this a lot. And this may be a bold statement, but I do believe it. I do think that this is going to be the biggest leap forward in design on the web since responsive design itself. One could argue it's even bigger because that would have been a big deal even before responsive design. I'm really thrilled about this, and I get more so every time I work on this. And thanks to the hard work of Miles Maxfield at Apple, I can actually show it to you. Shipped in the nightly build Friday night of this past week. It's not using a true variable font, but one that works kind of like it. We're now going to flip over to the bleeding edge of a nightly build of a web browser with an experimental technology that will probably fail miserably. But if it doesn't, it's going to be really cool, and I think you're going to be really excited. So let's give that a shot. So if you remember, I mentioned 18 fonts. So what I have here is a web page that's loading the fonts from Google. It is loading 18 different font files, widths and variants. 549K of font information to get the variety of type that I'm using in this page. Now, it's not the most beautifully designed page. I admit I'm being a little bit artificial in finding ways to call all of them to make sure they all get loaded. Even over the conference Wi-Fi, it's actually still loading pretty quickly, so that kind of takes away from my point a little. Oh, then Safari crashed. Oops. Don't check. All right. So now this has been set up with all the sort of usual tricks that I have for responsive design. So everything does sort of scale to fit appropriately on those different devices. But it is loading 18 files. And while we may be over a really fast connection right now, you can imagine what that would be like if you were off the conference Wi-Fi 4 stories underground with 1 bar trying to load that on your iPhone. Think about somebody who lives outside a metropolitan area or somebody on the subway. There's a lot of problems with that. So it'd be a lot cooler if it was just one asset that, as the screen resized, everything just works. So bear in mind, the spacing is going to be a little bit wonky. This is not a true Opentype variation font, but notice a few things happening there. Watch the heading in the body copy, how much narrower it is on a small screen. Imagine if we could tighten up the width and expand the X height of those lowercase characters for better readability on a small screen, but then as the screen gets bigger, gets a little wider, gets a little heavier, adds a little bit more weight to it. That's an incredible amount of flexibility. One file being referenced here. That's it. And the syntax for it, I mean, this is all just basic CSS. This is the code that's driving it. So it looks like this. And all this code is up on GitHub. I'm going to show you the link in just a minute, so you can play around with this too. If you've got a Mac, you just need to go and get the nightly build, and the link is right in the page to download Safari. Not the technical preview, the nightly build. When we download that, you can take this code and run it, and you can see here under font variation settings, you can alter these values. With this particular typeface, it's between 0 and 2, basically. So you can play around with that. If something's not understood, it's just ignored. Now, the syntax may change. This is all under discussion, and that's another important thing that I'm going to show to you, is that it's up to us. We're the ones that are actually going to drive this and make it happen. Those links on the left, you can get the slides from the first one, the code from the second. The instructions are there. It's all up on GitHub. There's nothing else that you need. The code is a bit.ly link, which apparently I misspelled because I didn't get the H out of there. bit.ly/JPVF code. Now, what's really important, let me go back a couple of slides. These links here on the bottom. So the first one will get you to Miles Maxfield's post on his blog showing this in action. And he's the guy that, all credit due to him, he's the one that got the code in here. He's the one that started writing the spec for the W3C. That second link is our job. All of us who are going to play with this need to go there to GitHub and comment and discuss. That is where this spec is being decided. That is how we define our web. It is our web, but only if we speak up and participate. So that's something that I'm trying to do my part to do better about that and actually participate in the discussion there. But if the browser vendors and the standards writers don't know what's important to us as designers and developers, then they're not going to consider it. They won't get it. So if we want better underlining, if we want support for hyphenation in Chrome, which we finally got after a whole lot of us bugged them about it for a long time. It shipped just a few weeks ago. We finally get hyphenation in Chrome. On the desktop on Mac OS. It's already there in other platforms. I think it's already shipping in Android. But be that as it may, that's how it happens, is we speak up, we talk about the things that are important to us, and we make sure that it's known. So please do that. I'll go back to that last slide so you can see the links to the code again. And we have a few minutes left for questions. I've got 5 copies of my book, and I've got a bunch of little coupon codes for additional discounts on O'Reilly. I would love to answer your questions. Thank you very much. Questions? Anyone? The back over there? I may have been somewhat deliberate. So the question is, what's going to be the comparison? Logical first question. How big is that one font file going to be? And the answer is not as small as a single WAF file. That's a certainty. What's going on in that file is it's storing all of the deltas between a normal character and the thinnest and thickest and every other axis. So the answer is we don't know yet. So for comparison, it was about $450K for the system-installed version of Skia, which is the typeface that's being called. But that's in no way really an indicator because it's an older TrueType GX font that's being used to sort of cheat things a little bit. It is likely, my guess is we'll see them start at $200 to $300K and maybe get smaller from there. It may turn out that things like italics need to be in a separate file. And then slant and everything else might be in the main one. It's kind of an unknown, but that's why all of us need to test it and participate so we can see how it works. But you have to know everybody's involved in this. Every single type vendor is excited about it and participating. Everyone's listening.
I just wanted to add on to that WAF2 will already compress this variable file. Just what they do, WAF2 will already cover it and already make it more.
So that's great. A lot of it is... It's been anticipated, so work is ongoing. You over here?
Are there going to be generators for these variable font types, or like files, or are they going to be type foundry responsibility?
It'll come from the type foundries. But Glyph is already working on it. Font Lab 6, they're already incorporating it into the product. They're still working it out. None of it's released yet. I mean, this is not even 3 weeks out. So there's tremendous excitement about it. It's probably going to be a few months before everything's shipping in the browser, but now is the time that we can shape that spec. Is it the right syntax? Should we be using a different syntax in the CSS? These things need to be fleshed out, so that's why it's so important that we all give it a try. Back corner?
You mentioned some performance notifications earlier on. Now, will this will font subsetting be available?
So the question was about whether or not font subsetting will be available. And I don't really have an answer for you, though I suspect it's as likely to be available with that as it is with any other format. So Google allows you to subset stuff in the call that you make to the web font service. Some other platforms are working on it, but when you're talking about sort of dynamically generating that subset, everybody's paying attention to it because especially with CJK and outside Western languages, the number of characters in a font is massive, so you need something. So it's in the works. It probably will happen. It may not be something that you have to do anything about. That's really the bottom line. More questions? Because I don't think we've had enough questions as there are books, so somebody's got to come up with something. There we go. All right. Jem, and you?
I'm wondering if this new standard might affect accessibility and screen reading kind of routines in any way.
So the fantastic thing about using actual fonts is that they're great for accessibility. So there's nothing in the format that necessarily makes it better other than the fact that we're using real text rather than an image of text or some other kind of substitution. So while it's not really directly better or worse, the more we embrace using this rather than any other way to impart that information, then it is absolutely better for people using screen readers or any other kind of assistive technology.
A bit of a design question and a little bit off tangent from the previous sets over here. So, are you aware of whether it is advisable, for example, if you're going to be publishing like a 3,000 word kind of thing, is it better to use a serif or a sans serif? Because I've always been hearing this thing that if you want people to stay on the page and everything, if you want it to be forgiving of the lengthy content, it should be serif.
Well, okay, so the question is serif or sans serif, and the quality of the display greatly impacts the answer. The quality of the typeface and its rendering as a font is also an important part of it, but it also depends on the user, because it's generally thought to be true that for people with any form of dyslexia, the serifs can actually be a little bit harder to work with, so sans serif is maybe a little better, but only if it's got strong differentiation between opposing characters like B and D. So it's a huge it depends, but it really does, choosing the quality of that typeface is more important than whether it is a serif or sans serif in the first place. That's really, and you have to test that and evaluate it. I think we're about out of time. One more question, all the way in the back.
How do you think this will affect how typographers, like the creative process, and if they will get involved, or the setback and maybe continue how they
So are you, let me just make sure I understand the question, type designers or designers who are setting the type in the designs that we're trying to put on the web?
type designers create like a company? Do they consider this, or
The type designers themselves are, actually from what I've been led to believe, are actually already working in this way. Most of them have been working this way for quite some time. The underlying idea of it's a spine of the letter and then everything's built out from there. That's the way a lot of people have been working for a long time. So actually for the type designers themselves, it's not as big a shift. And I can tell you from being in a room full of really nerdy type designers just a few weeks ago, they were pretty excited about this. So, I mean, it actually will simplify things in some sense where they only have to generate a single file. and they have a little bit more control over how it gets used. I think that's about all we have time for. You've been amazing. Thank you very much. Come on up. So